Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. This today's chapter is from the first Casualty by Philip Knightley, and chapter 2 is called The First Challenge from 1861 to 1865. I have made arrangements for the correspondents to take the field, and I have suggested to them that they should wear a white uniform to indicate the purity of their character. Union General Irvin McDowell, quoted by William Howard Russell in My Diary North and South. The Civil War remains the greatest single event in American history, and it was therefore vital that it be properly reported by correspondents of ability and integrity. The opportunities for good reporting were clearly present. The war created a tremendous demand for news, and as newspaper circulation soared and incomes increased, proprietors plowed back much of their new riches into sending more correspondents to provide a wider coverage of the conflict. Some 500 went off to report the war for the North alone. The New York Herald put 63 men into the field and spent nearly $1 million in covering the war. The New York Tribune and the New York Times each had at least 20 correspondents, and smaller papers in such places as Cincinnati and Boston all had their own men at the front. The South, for reasons to be discussed later, was less well served. European war correspondents, such as William Howard Russell of the Times of London and Georges Clemenceau of Le Temps, were there, and many European newspapers devoted almost as much space to the war as did the American press. Only on the visual side did technology fail to meet demand. The photographer Matthew Brady followed the Northern armies into battle and produced a comprehensive pictorial account of the war. But, unfortunately, no newspaper was able to use his or any other photographs because they all lacked the equipment and technique for making half-tone blacks. Instead, the war artist flourished, and although some became caught up in the production of faked or exaggerated reporting that afflicted many correspondents, others produced detailed and accurate records of the battles they witnessed. Illustrated weeklies such as Harper's and Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly flourished, the latter alone employing some 80 artists and publishing in 4 years more than 3,000 sketches and drawings of battles, sieges, bombardments, stormings, and other scenes incidental to war. The telegraph was available for large-scale use for the first time. Almost 50,000 miles of telegraph line were in use in the eastern states, and although the rates were high and the companies often demanded cash in advance before they would begin transmission, the byline by telegraph became more frequent as the war progressed. Newspapers that had never carried more than an occasional column of telegraphed news now carried 2 and 3 pages, at least one of which had been kept open until the last minute or so as to include the latest news. As a result, the reporting of the Civil War was not only more extensive than in any previous war, but also more immediate. For the first time in American history, it was possible for the public to read what had happened yesterday rather than someone's opinion on what had happened last week. Everything was ready, then, for the sweeping change in journalistic practice that was to make America a nation of newspaper readers. It was during the Civil War, the New York Times noted in 1901, that the New York papers gained the first realizing sense of 2 fundamental principles that have made them what they are today. First, the surpassing value of individual, competitive, triumphant enterprise in getting early and exclusive news, and second, the possibility of building up circulations by striving increasingly to meet a popular demand for the prompt and adequate reports of the day-to-day doings of mankind the world over. Yet, despite the opportunities that this great watershed in history offered correspondents, the conclusion must be that they measured up poorly to the task. Like many other aspects of the Civil War, its war correspondents have been romanticized into legend. The science of military correspondence was brought to its highest development and maximum effectiveness during the Civil War, wrote Havilah Babcock in 1929, by which time the story of the, quote, Bohemian Brigade, end quote, braving shot and shell to bring an eager public a true account of the great struggle, was firmly established. The incidents concerned men like Henry Wing of the New York Tribune being kissed by Lincoln for bringing a message from Grant, William Crawford, who also of the Tribune, was reading Byron to Union soldiers around the fire, Joseph Howard of the New York Times telegraphing the genealogy of Jesus to prevent his rivals from using the wire, and Edmund Stedman of the New York World sitting with his colleagues and writing dispatches by the light of a candle on top of a keg of gunpowder. The legend conveniently overlooks the fact that the majority of the Northern correspondents were ignorant, dishonest, and unethical, that the dispatches they wrote were frequently inaccurate, often invented, partisan, and inflammatory. Edward Godkin wrote of his American colleagues, "Their communications are what you might expect from men of this stamp, a series of wild ravings about the roaring of the guns, and the whizzing of the shells, and the superhuman valor of the men, interspersed with fulsome puffs of some captain or colonel with whom they happened to pass the night." Henry Villard, one of the better American correspondents, said, "Men turned up in the army as correspondents more fit to drive cattle than to write for newspapers." And Professor J. Cutler Andrews, in his mammoth work, The New North Reports the Civil War, wrote, "Sensationalism and exaggeration, alt-right lies, puffery, slander, fake eyewitness accounts, and conjectures built on pure imagination cheapen much of what passed for news in the North. Given that it was an age of declamatory journalism, and that objectivity was a rare quality, it is little disconcerting to find that one correspondent saw his job in these terms: It is not within the province of your correspondent to criticize what has been done by Army or Navy, nor will he state occurrences which may be unpleasant to read." Like him, most correspondents on both sides saw as an integral part of their task the sustaining of both civilian and army morale. A skirmish became, quote, "a glorious, overwhelming victory," end quote, and a rout was transformed into a, quote, "a strategic withdrawal before a vastly superior enemy," end quote. A dead Confederate soldier had not been merely killed in battle, but, quote, "sacrificed to the devilish ambitions of his implacable masters, Davis and Lee," end quote. Confederate women had necklaces made from Yankee eyes, while the, quote, "unholy Northerners," end quote, used the heads of Confederates dead for footballs. And this sort of reporting, accuracy mattered little, and the Northerner Henry Adams wrote from London to complain that people have become so accustomed to the idea of disbelieving everything that is stated in the American papers that all confidence in us is destroyed. The correspondents fared little better in recognizing the historic incident, in realizing that they were privileged to be present at moments millions would later want to study as part of their nation's development. No correspondent attending the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg took any notice of Lincoln beginning, "407 years ago." At the best, they reported, as did Cincinnati Commercial, quote, "The president rises slowly, draws from his pocket a paper, and when the commotion subsides in a sharp, unmusical treble voice, he reads brief and pithy remarks," and at the worst, ended their accounts of the event with the sentence, "The president also spoke." One would have expected that the war correspondents from Europe, more experienced, more mature, and less involved than their American colleagues, performed more ably in the Civil War. Unfortunately, the majority were as bad, if not worse. More subtle in their bias, more devious in their propaganda, and better assisted by the political intrigues of their editors, they completely misled their readers on what was really occurring in America. The Times of London was particularly bad. There was never a war which afforded much materials for special correspondence of the best kind as this one, wrote Edwin Godkin. Yet, faced with this great opportunity, most Civil War correspondents failed miserably. The reasons are not hard to find. The main one was that no American correspondent had any previous experience to fit him for such a task. The Associated Press, the only organization that had the resources to attempt a comprehensive coverage of the war, was in its infancy. Most of its correspondents had been chosen primarily because of their ability to use a telegraph key, and the techniques of military reporting had to be learnt by trial and error. Correspondents sent to the front by northern newspapers were young. Most of them were in their late 20s. 6 were only 19 or younger, inexperienced penny-a-liners who were more at home covering the police courts. The pay and condition were not calculated to attract men of ability. Salaries ranged from $10 to $25 a week, including expenses, and it was not until late in the war, when individual correspondents had made names for themselves, that editors were prepared to pay more generously. The work was physically and emotionally exhausting. Stories had to be written on the same day as the battle, and correspondents would work all night, gallop off at daybreak to the nearest rail or telegraph head, lodge their copy, and then gallop back to witness that day's activities. Small wonder, then, that few, estimates range from 1 to 10, of the 500 northern reporters were able to last the whole war. In spite of this, editors were unreasonably demanding. As the public's hunger for the war news mounted, so did circulations. A large New York paper could sell 5 times its normal circulation when it ran details of a big battle, while the Philadelphia Inquirer, nearer the front, frequently sold 25,000 copies of a single issue to the troops alone. This meant serious money, and when no news was available, editors chafed at the loss of income and pressed their correspondents harder. Wilbur F. Story, of the Chicago Times, sent an order to one of his men: "Telegraph fully all news you can get, and when there is no news, send rumors." Soon, initiative and resource in getting a scoop came to count for more than accuracy and balance, and the commercial pressures were such that a correspondent was far more likely to be sacked for sending no news at all than if he sent an interesting but completely fabricated story. All this did nothing for correspondents' morale or ethics. They were constantly short of money and had difficulty getting themselves reimbursed even for justified expenses. For example, when Villard of the New York Tribune presented one expense account, his editor knocked him to the floor. Soon, many correspondents came to see nothing wrong in making a little money on the side. Some accepted cash from officers in return for a favorable mention in their dispatches and thought nothing of it. "If a man ever needed $50, it is I," Edmund Stedman said in the New York World to his wife after General Charles T. James, a Northern artillery officer, had pressed it on him. "Of course he expects me to keep a lookout for his guns hereafter, and I believe I can do so with a clear conscience." Others became involved in stock exchange manipulations, using their knowledge of forthcoming legislation or the sway of a battle to tip off influential financiers. "Allow me to assure you that I will make you a pile," wrote one New York financier to a correspondent in Washington, "if you can get the news in advance when the market is not excited by the same news." Pressure for a scoop forced many correspondents into positions that compromised any ethics they might have started with. Tom Cook of the New York Herald wanted a boat to enable him to cover naval engagements. Realizing his paper would be unlikely to provide him with one, he made his own arrangements and then wrote to his editor, "I think the Navy Department could be induced to procure for us an outside vessel which we might call our own, were we to promise that the Navy Department would be exempt from attacks in the columns of the Herald." The hint is, of course, sub rosa. Other correspondents took paid or unpaid jobs with the administration or the Army. Horace White of the Chicago Tribune was clerk of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. L.A. Whiteley of the New York Herald worked also as a clerk in the Treasury Department. Sam Wilkeson of the New York Tribune had a second job preparing Northern propaganda for distribution in Europe. William Shanks of the New York Herald was a volunteer aide to General Lavelle H. Rousseau. Deb R. Keim of the Herald, a volunteer aide of General Sherman. Tom Cook, a volunteer aide to General Daniel Sickles. The fault was not always with the correspondence. Poor communications hampered better reporting. The Union Army's inefficient mail service frequently lost letters. The New York Tribune estimated that half its mail dispatches from correspondents in the field never reached New York, and in the South, the letter could take a month to reach its destination. This tended to confine correspondents to those areas where they were assured of telegraphic contact with their offices, or, if the lines were down or occupied, were within striking distance by horse or train of New York, Washington, or any large rail junction, a handicap that will soon be seen to color the entire northern reporting of the war. Censorship, imposed to prevent the publication of information of value to the enemy, was expanded to stifle criticism of the conduct of the war. When all these factors combined to harry the already hard-pressed correspondent, his reporting of the war grew worse instead of better, and the few competent men gave up in disgust and withdrew. In the South, the outbreak of war found a partisan political press that was 30 years behind the times. Most newspapers were weeklies with small circulations, and even a daily like the New Orleans Picayune sold less than 6,000 copies. The presses, most of the newsprint, and many an editor came from northern states. There was little attempt to separate news from editorial opinion. News columns were filled with political propaganda, and fair and objective reporting was almost unknown. Without sufficient general appeal to produce a larger income, the Southern press found itself with neither the resources nor the men to attempt coverage of the war on anything approaching the scale of the North. Although it managed to put about 100 war correspondents into the field, many of these were serving officers who had volunteered to send a telegram or letter when circumstances permitted, and do not qualify as genuine correspondents. Newspapers had to rely heavily on the Press Association of Confederate States, formed to replace the loss of the Associated Press Service from New York, and on a small corps of civilian correspondents, including one or two women, and many of whom worked for more than one newspaper. For example, using various pseudonyms, George W. Bagby contributed to 23. The South's initial handicap became even greater as the war progressed. With the Northern forces moved into the Confederacy, many newspapers suffered curtailment or total and peremptory dissolution at the hands of the Union Army. A few, such as the Memphis Appeal and the Chattanooga Rebel, managed to survive by retreating with the Southern forces and printing in other towns, always one move ahead of the Northern armies. For all of them, there was the constant struggle to get the paper out, with staffs depleted by the call to arms. There was no paper issued from the Confederate office on Saturday morning, its editor in Macon, Georgia, wrote the next day. Every man in the establishment was in the field on Saturday. We hope our subscribers will consider this a sufficient excuse. As newsprint and ink supplies dried up, the Southern papers grew smaller until, for example, the Charleston Courier was down to a single sheet. Others took to printing on wrapping paper, writing paper, paper bags, and even on the blank side of wallpaper. The Alexander, North Carolina Pictorial Democrat and the Thibodaux, Louisiana Stars and Stripes were but two that were forced to such lengths. It would have been difficult enough to produce a record of the war's progress under these circumstances. The attitude of most Confederate war correspondents made it impossible. They believed that loyalty to the cause of the South came before any professional requirements of truth and objectivity. Accordingly, they maintained an attitude of optimism in their reporting, even when, in the later stages of the war, the Confederacy was collapsing around them. They exaggerated Northern casualties, minimized Southern ones, reported the capture of Northern towns that had not even been attacked, and refused to admit that the Confederate Army ever retreated. A series of backward movements, improperly called a retreat by those who do not comprehend them, was in reality retrograde maneuvers. A dispatch reporting a Southern victory was likely to begin, "Glory to God in the highest." The North was the cursed, cowardly nation of swindlers and thieves, the abolition infidel foe. Northern soldiers went into battle primed with whiskey, or drunk with wine, blood, and fury. Cowed by censorship, determined to maintain morale, and poorly served by the majority of its correspondents, the Confederate press lent itself to the government's propaganda line much more readily than did the Northern press. Evidence for this is the fact that at least 20 newspapers were suppressed in the North, compared with only one in the South. The rest swung behind the Confederate war effort, keeping their criticism within well-defined limits, avoiding a, quote, despondent fault-finding tone, end quote, and trying, as one editor instructed his correspondent at the front, to, quote, give the dear weekly public as much as possible of the bright side of things, end quote. The North, on the other hand, was witnessing the first attempt at saturation coverage. As a mass of correspondents jostled for positions, the very strength of their numbers began to militate against good reporting. Comradeship and compassion vanished in the race for exclusive news. One correspondent begged a wounded officer not to die before he had finished interviewing him, and, as an inducement, promised him that his last words would appear in the, quote, widely circulated and highly influential journal I represent, end quote. J. Hay Doherty of the Louisville Journal and William Furey of the Cincinnati Gazette, returning from a battle, were in a train crash. They surprised each other by groping about in the dark, each looking for the other man's body to steal his notes on the battle. The Gazette, scooped on the Northern retreat, said that there should be an investigation, and that if the story proved exaggerated, then the correspondent who had written it should be, quote, hung by the neck until dead, end quote. Accuracy became a minor consideration. Casualties were grossly underestimated. Generals listed as killed lived on to die of old age. Battles were reported on days when there was no action at all. At times, the whole Southern army was reported to be marching on Washington. Atlanta was reported captured a week before the battle for the town took place. It was but a small step from ignoring accuracy to faking whole reports. Junius Brown of the New York Tribune collected from officers details of the Battle of Pea Ridge, which took place in March 1862, and wrote a brilliant but entirely imaginary eyewitness report. To the chagrin of the two correspondents who had actually seen the battle, Brown's dispatch was acclaimed by the Times of London as, quote, the ablest and best battle account which has been written during the American War, end quote. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 caught correspondents by surprise, so they dashed off dispatches about desperate hand-to-hand fighting that had never occurred. a mass effort of faking reports that led to a cynical acceptance of the practice. Even war artists are not above faking their sketches. When Southern cavalry set fire to some Northern Army trains near Chattanooga in October 1863, Harper's Weekly carried sketches of the scene from its artist, quote, on the spot, end quote, whereas in fact the artist had been 20 miles away at the time. Censorship had been applied in a loose and haphazard manner since Bull Run, the first clash of the war. There, early indications of Northern superiority had sent the Northern war correspondents hurrying to Washington to write accounts of a great victory. Back on the battlefield, the Southern troops turned the Union Army and a rout followed. Although the Associated Press in Washington managed to get news out of this momentous defeat to the telegraph office to be sent to New York, it went no farther. The General-in-Chief of the Northern forces, Winfield Scott, had stopped its transmission, and so the result of the first major act of censorship in the war was chaos. With all the New York newspapers carrying stories of a glorious victory that was, in fact, a scandalous defeat. Later, censorship suffered from confusion over who was to enforce it. At different times during the war, it was administered by the State, Treasury, and War Departments. And, inevitably, the intention to suppress only information of value to the enemy became also the desire to suppress material damaging to the North side. The Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, began to dicker with casualty figures. He altered an account of Grant's failure at Petersburg, resulting in reducing the losses about a third of their actual number. His department withheld news of the surrender of Harper's Ferry for 24 hours and changed, quote, 10,000 Union troops surrendered, first to 6,000, and in later dispatches to 4,000. The actual figure was 11,200. Stanton took to suspending newspapers that had broken his censorship rules, arresting editors, threatening proprietors with court-martial, and banning correspondence from the front. And he actually issued orders for Henry Wing of the New York Tribune to be shot for refusing to hand over a dispatch he had written for his newspaper. Still, censorship did not work. So, early in 1864, Stanton had been issuing his own dispatches in the form of a war diary, addressed ostensibly to the chief military authority in New York, but put out through the Associated Press, a scheme that Southern newspapers failed to persuade the Confederate government to follow. These daily war bulletins, the beginning of a practice adopted in later wars in most countries of the world, set forth briefly the situation in each command and represented the administration's attempts to counter the lies, rumors, and alarmist reports some war correspondents were writing. Stanton's feud with the correspondents had a mixed reception in the army. Some of the more politically minded generals had come to enjoy the publicity that dispatches from the front had brought them. One senior officer even wrote a report of one of his actions and gave it to the Associated Press for distribution. Others had formed close relationships with the correspondents they trusted. Grant allowed Sylvanus Cadwallader of the New York Herald to travel in his entourage and used him to carry messages to Lincoln. But in general, the army hated the correspondents and did its best to get rid of them. General George Meade objected to the way he was treated in a dispatch filed by Edward Crapsey of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and ordered Crapsey to be expelled by the army. The unfortunate correspondent was placed backward on an old horse. A placard marked, quote, libeler of the press, end quote, was tied to his chest, and he was paraded through the army on the tune of, quote, Rogue's March, end quote. Meade later relented and said he had realized, on reflection, that the punishment was unnecessarily severe, but by that time it was too late. Crapsey's colleagues had got together and decided that Meade's name would never be mentioned in a dispatch again, a boycott so effective that some claim it was a major factor in the failure of the politically ambitious Meade to become President of the United States. But no one hated war correspondence more than General Sherman did. Now to every army and almost every general and newspaper reporter goes along, filling up our transports, swelling our trains, reporting our progress, guessing at places, picking up dropped expressions, inciting jealousy and discontent, and doing infinite mischief. Sherman said he would willingly agree to give half his pay to have his name kept out of the newspapers, and he took all the steps he could to try to prevent correspondents from traveling with him, including the threat to treat them as spies. And General Joseph Hooker introduced a simpler stratagem. With Stanton's support, he issued orders that all dispatches had to be published under the correspondent's name. Robbed of the anonymity that had protected their speculation, inaccuracy, and comment, the correspondence with Hooker became much more discreet. Sherman's attitude, combined with the communication difficulties that the reporting of the battles involved, frightened away all but the most determined correspondents. Thus, the weight of reporting in the North was about Grant, while Sherman's campaigns in the West and South were poorly reported. Yet they were the campaigns that won the war, and for sheer richness of material went unrivaled. When Sherman captured Atlanta and then set out to march through Georgia to the sea, thus splitting the Confederacy and destroying its resources, only 8 correspondents went along with him, a handful, compared with the contingents of correspondents on other fronts, and many major newspapers, including the New York Times, were not represented. Their reporting was accurate and fair, but they lacked the imagination to comprehend what they were witnessing. They saw Sherman's 60-mile-wide scorched earth sweep as an army living off the country, Sherman's bummers reducing the collection of supplies to a science, and if the Southerners along the line of the march suffered, then it has been the fortune of the war they voted for. None of them realized that they were seeing an important concept, total war, in the making. Sherman himself did. In a dispatch that shows a talent the correspondents might have well envied, Sherman set out for Lincoln exactly what he had done to the Confederacy. We have consumed the corn and fodder in the region of the country 30 miles on either side of a line from Atlanta to Savannah, as also the sweet potatoes, cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry, and have carried away more than 10,000 horses and mules, as well as countless members of slaves. I estimate the damage done to the state of Georgia and its military resources at $100 million, at least $20 million of which has been insured at our advantage, and the remainder is simple waste and destruction. And instead of war correspondent, it was left to one of Sherman's staff officers, Major George Nichols, to write the best account of this march of, quote, waste and destruction, unquote. It appeared in the New York Evening Post and was later expanded into a book, The Story of the Great March, from the diary of a staff officer, one of the most successful of the early post-war period. What other stories did correspondents miss, fail to get past the censors, underplay, or refrain from writing? One of the cruel facts of the war was that the North, although it considered itself to be fighting for the survival of democracy, could not raise enough volunteers willing to risk their life for this cause. The South claimed that Northern men of military age were so unwilling to join the army that the majority of the Union troops were foreigners. This seems unlikely, but even taking the Northern official figures, 1 soldier in 3 was foreign, most of them being German or Irish. Some Eastern states had to introduce a bounty system to fill their regiments, a practice that led to men being shanghaied into service, and when conscription was introduced in 1863, New York was hit by the worst riots in the nation's history. From the 13th to the 16th of July, the city went completely out of control as the riots took on anti-black as well as anti-draft overtones. Finally, a state of insurrection was proclaimed, and troops were brought by forced marches from victorious Gettysburg to crush the rioters. The draft in New York was suspended, but the riots continued intermittently and remained front-page news until October. The final death toll amounted to roughly nearly 1,000. Many more were injured, and property damage ran to several $1,000,000. And the New York Times reported the insurrection fully. The reign of rabble, the New York Times called it. But the Southern newspapers had a field day. Many posed the question the North was reluctant to ask. If the cause of the Union was a noble one, why was there such violent opposition to the idea of fighting for it? The reluctance to serve in the Union Army should be placed in context. Conditions were poor. Many Army surgeons were incompetent. Contractors made fortunes by selling uniform cloth made from factory clippings and sweepings. The quartermasters and commissary departments in both armies were staffed by thieves. Defective cartridges were not unusual, and punishment for minor offenses in both North and South was barbarous. The penalty for desertion or bounty jumping was death, and sometimes a mass shooting took place in front of an entire regiment, with an enclosure for war correspondents and artists from Harper's or Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, and a band to play a dirge before the shooting, and a popular hit tune, The Girl I Left Behind Me, afterwards. The capture meant imprisonment under vile conditions. Both sides cared little for the health of prisoners of war, and exposure, inadequate medical care, ignorance of ordinary sanitation, and malnutrition in the midst of plenty caused the deaths of thousands of prisoners. There was friction between Eastern and Western regiments in the Northern Army, and enmity between regular officers and volunteers. In the South, the friction was between troops from Virginia and North Carolina. In the North, there was a powerful prejudice against accepting black troops, which was overcome only by the failure to get enough white volunteers. Although many black units fought well, they were never really accepted. The South organized a few regiments of slaves only when the war was nearly over. Blacks will do to fight blacks, one Confederate war correspondent wrote, and bitterly resented the North's use of black troops against white men. So when the Southern General Bedford Forrest stormed Fort Pillow in April 1864 and found a Union force that included 262 black men, he massacred them, according to a congressional investigation, after resistance had ceased. How many of these sensitive yet important facts were reported? The difficulties the Union Army had in filling its ranks were ignored where possible. The New York draft riots could not, for example, be overlooked. In its turn, the South suppressed reports of the Richmond bread riots of April 1863 and failed to report that many plantation owners flatly refused to lead their slaves to be used as laborers on military projects. The brutality of army discipline was not reported except when it was thought, as in the case of mass shootings, that publicity would have a deterrent effect. Friction in the army was generally not reported unless it involved high-ranking officers, and in fact, North correspondents were known to write about fraternal fellowship between Eastern and Western troops, when in reality only ill feeling existed. They were fighting side by side for the Union, and the blood they are shedding together will add another bond of eternal friendship between East and West, wrote one. Racism in the Union Army was overlooked, and in any event, stories about it would certainly not have been passed by the censor, because the difficulty the Army was having in getting troops to accept black recruits and to agree, as a popular Union song expressed it, that there existed Sambo's right to be killed. Neither side made capital out of conditions by the other out of conditions of the other's prisons. Uh, in case this led to close in case this led to too close a look on it at its own. In the north, there was some mild reporting of graft, and Frank Wilkie of the New York Times exposed some medical mismanagement. But as the foundation of many a day fortune testifies, none but the major scandals in either quartermaster's corps or the army contracting systems were uncovered. The South fared better in this field. Frauds in the commissary and quartermaster's departments, which had deprived the troops of blankets and food, were exposed in Confederate newspapers. Peter Alexander wrote movingly in the Mobile Daily Advertiser and Register on the inhuman treatment of the wounded in grossly inadequate army hospitals. A planter who would take as little care of the health of his slaves as the government does of its soldiers would be driven out of the community by his indignant neighbors. Pay scandals, some troops were not paid for a year, and misconduct by officers and public officials were the subjects of bitter attack by one or two of the better Southern correspondents. But the real extent of sickness, low morale, wartime profiteering, and desertion from the Southern armies was never revealed. Confederate correspondents, when they mentioned desertion at all, tried carefully to avoid the actual word and preferred to use absentees or stragglers. There were a few good correspondents. A handful in the North and one or two in the South worked hard to keep the public informed on what was going on. In the North, H. Whitelaw Reid of the Cincinnati Gazette, one of the foremost correspondents in the war, and later an author of note, wrote the facts as he saw them, without fear or favor. But he was a racist and believed that between whites and blacks a separation should be made as soon as practicable. Charles Coffin of the Boston Journal was a good, straight battle reporter, describing only what he saw or he knew on good authority to be true. George Smalley of the New York Tribune wrote that what was generally acclaimed as the best report of the Battle of Antietam, and perhaps of the whole war. Henry Villard of the Tribune was an outspoken correspondent, not afraid of telling even Lincoln what he felt was wrong with his army, and Sylvanus Cadwallader of the New York Herald had an eye for the historic moment. He was present when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, and while his colleague Henry Wing of the Tribune rushed off to try for a scoop, Cadwallader was able to note the shameful scramble for souvenirs from the room where the surrender had been signed. It began quietly, with General George Custer paying the owner, Wilmer McLean, $25 for one of the tables used during the signing. Then officers began forcing money into McLean's hands, but now McLean threw it back. Suddenly, there was a rush, and the furniture was gone. Cadwallader wrote, cane-bottom chairs were ruthlessly cut to pieces, the cane splits broken into pieces by a few inches long, and parceled out among those who swarmed around. Haircloth upholstery was cut from chairs, and sofas were also cut into stripes and patches and carried away. Isolated pieces of reporting showed that some correspondents, unlike the majority, saw the futile, bloody side of the war and were disgusted by it. Ned Spencer of the Cincinnati Times made no great name for himself, but he did write this disturbing paragraph about the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh. As I sit tonight writing this epistle, the dead and wounded are all around me. The knife of the surgeon is busy at work, and amputated legs and arms lie scattered in every direction. The cries of the suffering victim and the groans of those who patiently await for medical assistance are most distressing to anyone who had any sympathy for his fellow man. All day long they have been coming in, and they are placed upon the decks and within cabins of the steamers, and wherever else they can find a resting place. I hope my eyes may never again look upon such sights. Samuel Wilson of the New York Times wrote what was probably the most poignant piece of the war. Sent to help cover the battle at Gettysburg, he learned that his son had been wounded in the leg and, abandoned by the doctors, had died. Wilson sat down just the same and wrote this story. Headquarters, Army of Potomac, Saturday night, July 4th. Who can write the history of a battle whose eyes are immovably fastened upon a central figure of transcendingly important interest, the dead body of an eldest born, crushed by a shell in a position where a battery should never have been sent, and abandoned to death in a building where surgeons dared not to stay? The Battle of Gettysburg. I am told that it commenced on the 1st of July, a mile north of the town, between the weak brigade of infantry and some doomed artillery, and the whole force of the rebel army. Among other costs of fatal error was the death of Reynolds. Its value was priceless, however, though priceless was the young and the old blood with which it was bought. For such details as I have a heart for, side of horseshoe position, exactly opposite to that which Ewell had sworn to crush through. The story closed with these words: "My pen is heavy. Oh, you dead, who died at Gettysburg, have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America. How you are to be envied. I rise from a grave whose wet clay I have passionately kissed, and I look up and see Christ spanning this battlefield." In the South, the only outstanding correspondent was Peter Alexander, a lawyer from Georgia, who had opposed disruption of the Union, but remained loyal to the South when the break occurred. Alexander was reliable, accurate, and honest, and the suffering of the ordinary soldier distressed him. He campaigned for shoes for barefooted troops, better medical attention, and action against drunken officers and army surgeons, whom he had seen, quote, so stupefied by liquor that they could not distinguish between a man's arm and the spoke of a wagon wheel, and who would just as soon have sawed off one as the other. With these exceptions, the coverage of the Civil War by American correspondents left, then, a lot to be desired, but it was immeasurably better than the corrupt and distorted picture of the war presented by the British press, especially by its leading paper, The Times. The American Civil War held considerable importance for Britain. In 1861, it was estimated that 1/5 of the entire British population was dependent directly or indirectly on the prosperity of the cotton manufacturing areas, which in turn depend on the American South for 80% of their supplies. This clear commercial relationship made for sympathy with the South, but after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, it also became an embarrassment, because then the commercial interest had to be reconciled with Britain's long-preached sentiments of humanity. A country so experienced in moral accommodation would no doubt have had little difficulty in bringing about this reconciliation, but the issue was further complicated by a major political factor. The ruling class in Britain had nurtured a barely concealed hatred of America and her democratic institutions, and now they dearly desired their downfall. If the American experiment in democracy could be shown to have failed, demands for greater democracy in Britain could be kept from becoming an issue. Britain's interest in the war, then, were very strong, and at one stage it appeared highly likely that she would actually intervene. The American general, Winfield Scott, in Paris on a propaganda mission for Lincoln, had to return to New York to prepare for its defense against the British invasion. Lincoln had realized from the beginning that the favor or disfavor of foreign nations, particularly English favor, could have considerable influence on the outcome of the war. The South, at first without the means of making a single gun, realized it would have to rely on Britain for arms, and also considered, correctly, that there was a good chance of bringing Britain into the war on the Confederate side. So both North and South mounted propaganda campaigns in Britain aimed at influencing opinions. The North began by dispatching abroad in October 1861 some gentlemen of intelligence and experience, possessing a good knowledge of all that circumstance preceding and accompanying the rebellion, to disabuse the public mind, especially in England and France, where numerous and active agents of secession and rebellion have been at work. In Washington, war correspondents were engaged to prepare a stream of propaganda material. Lincoln himself wrote a letter to working men of Manchester on January 19th, 1863, and another on February 2nd to London working men. Speakers toured Britain, put in the Northern case. The New York Herald correspondent, George Train, made 23 speeches in 2 months. Northern propagandists wrote secretly for the British press. The South's approach was much more venal. A war correspondent called Henry Hotz, a Swiss immigrant who had worked for the Register of Mobile, Alabama, was sent to Britain with a fund of Confederate Secret Service money to be used for suborning British journalists. He was apparently very successful. In his reports, he notes that he was able to find 7 London journalists willing to place news items and even editorials favorable to the Southern cause in return for payments, either in the form of boxes of cigars, whiskey, and other articles, or in cash. Hotz also was behind a weekly newspaper called The Index, which started in Britain on May 1st, 1862, nominally as a purely British publication, but secretly as a straightforward propaganda medium for the South. So with the Britons' direct interest in the outcome of the Civil War, and both sides operating secret propaganda complexes there, it was vital that public opinion be accurately informed about what was really happening in America. The Times, of course, was the major newspaper of the day. "I think I've never felt as much in this matter enormous power as the Times has," wrote Goldwin Smith, the historian, in 1863, "not from the quality of its writing, but from exclusive command of publicity and its exclusive access to a vast number of minds." But the Times began with a heavy disadvantage. Its chief proprietor, its editor, and its foreign manager were all singularly ill-equipped to handle the news from America during this important period of history. The chief proprietor, John Walter III, was openly anti-unionist. The editor, John Delane, was ignorant of American affairs and had little feeling for American institutions. The foreign manager, Mowbray Morris, had been born in the West Indies and was in sympathy with the South and slavery. Since these were the men who not only engaged the correspondents to cover the war, but also presented the news the correspondents sent, it is not surprising that the Times coverage of the Civil War caused such a cleavage between the two nations that it required a generation to heal it. The Times prepared for the war by sending William Howard Russell to America. Russell's reputation had grown greatly since the Crimean War. He had covered the Indian Mutiny in 1857 to 1858 and had shown a much sharper perception of the issues than that of his colleagues or his newspaper. While the Times was counseling bloody revenge against the Sepoys and their leaders, Russell had clearly seen that Britain's days in India were numbered. The Anglo-Saxons must either abate their strong natural feeling against the colored race, or look forward to the day when the indulgence of their passions will render the government of India too costly a luxury for the English people. His name was well known in America, and when he arrived, he dined with Lincoln and met other Northern leaders, who put the Union case to him. Then he went off on a tour of the South, where a first-hand study of the slave market disgusted him. The outbreak of war was thus found him deeply attached to the Union cause, and with a high opinion of Lincoln's motives. But as a seasoned war reporter, he had to report the first engagement at Bull Run the way he saw it. The untried Federal troops, watched by members of Congress and their ladies, who had arrived from Washington with picnic baskets and luggage tipped south to Richmond, broke before the Southern attack and fled in panic. Early reports of it had been of a Northern advance, and the New York papers carried their stories of a great victory. To have accepted that this, quote, victory, end quote, was actually a resounding defeat was bad enough. But when Russell's report appeared in the New York Times and was relayed back to New York, and American readers learned from it that their troops had fled in disgraceful rout, the nation, shocked, went into a period of gloom and apprehension, during which the easiest target for blame was Russell. Fury against him became so great that he was advised to seek protection within the walls of the British Embassy. This had convinced the Times that its low opinion of the North was justified. When the Trent affair flared up, Delane prepared for war. On November 8, 1861, a Union warship intercepted the British steamer Trent, and a boarding party arrested 2 Southern diplomatic envoys on their way to Europe. For context, the whole Army, Navy, and volunteers are of one mind, and all mad for service in America, he wrote to Russell. If we are foiled by a surrender of prisoners, there will be a universal feeling of disappointment. We expect, however, that they will show fight and hope for it, for we trust that it will give them such a dusting this time. Russell wrote urging restraint, and the crisis passed with the release of envoys on January 1st, 1862. There is reason for believing that the Times was not by now entirely happy with Russell and his still pro-Northern sentiments, and that Russell himself was having an unhappy time. A telegram had been sent to an American business friend when he had learnt through British diplomatic contacts that the Trent affair was about to be settled, leaked to the New York Herald, which accused him of financial speculation. Russell was unable to explain the situation satisfactorily, nor have his biographers been able to, and his reputation suffered. As well, he was having difficulty in getting permission to accompany any Northern army, so he left for Canada for a few weeks' break. The foreign manager, Morris, was furious. "You must either go to the front or come home. Up to the beginning of this year you did well, but since then you seem to have lost heart and have thrown us overboard." Russell made one more attempt to obtain a pass to the front, and when this failed, without telling the Times, he packed up and sailed for Britain. There he was awarded a pension, but he contributed no more to the Times on American affairs. As I from the first maintained the North must win, I was tabooed for dealing with American questions in the Times even after my return to England. But en revanche, I have had my say in the Army and the Navy Gazette, which I have bought. Russell's sudden departure left the Times without a war correspondent in the North, and hurried arrangements were made to find one. The man chosen was Charles Mackay, a journalist and poet of some reputation, who, on a tour of America in 1857, had contributed to the Illustrated London News. It is clear that Mackay was selected because he could be relied upon to send anti-Northern dispatches. I had apparently been successful in my application because my sympathies in the struggle were in accordance with those of the times, he wrote. Although Morris Mackay knew what sort of article he wanted, the Northern government and its policy are an abomination to me, and I greatly enjoy to hear them abused. He soon felt that Mackay had gone too far. I ask myself whether any government or set of men can be so wholly bad that not such as any such be. Let them be made known, then, if only to redeem your correspondence from the charge of systemic vituperation. Mackay badly was not moved, and the South became delighted with him. It missed him badly when he returned to Britain for a holiday, and there is evidence suggesting that it became so anxious to get him back to New York that it even paid his steamship passage. James Spence, a Liverpool merchant who acted as the Confederate financial advisor to Britain, reported, I have taken a berth for Mackay by Saturday's boat, so he will soon be out again, and he's dead for our side. The Times war correspondent in the South was Francis Lawley, formerly on the staff of British minister in Washington. He managed to get dispatches through at irregular intervals, usually sending them via the French diplomatic bag to Paris, from where the Times office then sent them to London. Lawley was a poor choice, strongly pro-South. I am at a loss to convey to you the contemptuous note in which the tried and war-torn soldiers of General Lee talked to the huddled rabble of black, white, and copper-colored victims, who were at times goaded up to the Southern lines. What was worse, he lacked the most elementary qualifications of a good reporter, the ability to recognize what is news. His first dispatch, filed from Richmond after he had made his way through the blockade, set the tone for the rest of his term. It ran 2.5 columns, and, as if to justify his expenses, Lawley carried on at length about the cost of living. Most of the rest of the dispatch was an outburst against the North, and a reminder of the South's fine pedigree. And these men, many of them bearing some of England's most honoured names and descended from England's most honoured families, are in the field and have been so far 19 months fighting against mercenaries who have repudiated England as though they were governed by a Nero, and have escaped from German penury and conscriptions. Whatever they may have been the truth last winter, it is not pretended now that the northern armies are not mainly composed of men of foreign birth. The engagement of war correspondents like Mackay and Lawley and the adoption of pro-South attitude in its leading articles were bad enough. But the Times went even further to promote the Southern cause. When New Orleans fell, it carried back black mourning borders. It suppressed the fact that a Liverpool shipyard was building a warship, the famous Alabama, for the South, and recorded her sailing to begin a career as a commerce raider, and only 5 words in its ship news column. And it commissioned Spence, the Confederate agent in Liverpool, to write a series of pro-South articles for the Times under the signature S, for which it made him a gift of specially bound edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. The combination of poor and subjective war correspondence and the attitude of the Times office towards America produced a disastrous coverage of the war. In July 1863, misled by Mackay, who was to be made to pay for it later, the Times confidently predicted that the Southern General Lee was about to capture Washington. In 1864, it reported Sherman's march to the sea as a folly from which he would find it difficult to extricate himself. When Sherman reached Savannah, Delane was made physically ill by the setback, but recovered rapidly and was able to write that the Times was doing its best to attenuate the mischief. This took the form of a piece which Sherman was given credit for one of the ablest, certainly one of the most singular military achievements of the war, but which then went on to say that the South had little use for Savannah as a port anyway. Russell, too, had his alter views radically as a result of had to alter his views radically as a result of Sherman's campaign. And the Army and Navy Gazette, Russell had said that Sherman was a wriggling about like a snake in the presence of an ichneumon. Sherman took Atlanta on the very same day this article appeared, but Russell had skin even thicker than the Times. In his next issue, he wrote implying that he had foreseen Sherman's success all along. General Sherman has fully justified his reputation as an able and daring soldier. In the beginning of the war, the Times referred to Lincoln as an uneducated rail splitter. Halfway through the war, he was a sort of moral American Pope, or Lincoln the Last. When he was assassinated, he was suddenly recognized as having been, quote, one of England's best friends, end quote. Naturally, this recognition that it had been wildly astray in its military and political estimates of the war was not accomplished by the Times without some unpleasant recriminations and extensive scapegoat hunting, although it was clear that at least some responsibility lay with executives who had allowed their prejudices to interfere with their selection of war correspondents and with the manner in which they were briefed. Blame had to be placed further down the editorial ladder. So Mackey was peremptorily sacked. Morris broke the news to him. This has been brought about by your blind and unreasonable condemnation of all public men and measures on the Federal side, he wrote. You have presented the English public with a distorted view of the Federal cause. Every statement was one-sided and every remark spiteful. One cannot feel a certain sympathy for Mackey. The shattering condemnation contrasts strongly with what the Times had thought of him only 2 years before. I assure you that your correspondence deserves, in my opinion, the most unqualified praise. The very same Morris had written then. The crux of the matter was, of course, that Mackey had been in high favor with the Times, quote, as long as fortune seemed to smile on the cause of the Southern Confederacy, end quote. When the South lost the war, Mackey lost his job. There was not a single British war correspondent who saw the great forces at work in the Civil American War and who tried to convey them to his readers. The Daily Telegraph had George Augustus Sala with the Army of the Potomac. Sala had a low opinion of American reporting. Hydra-headed, August-eyed, Dionys-eared, multi-tongued New York press, but wrote nothing remarkable on the war himself. M.B. Hewson, a remarkably pro-Southern, an English civil engineer, sent reports to the Herald, but was known for his markedly pro-Southern sympathies. The Daily News sent an artist, Frank Visitelli, one of the family of famous journalists, to cover the North Side. But Visitelli could not get accredited, so he crossed to the South by a secret route. There he visited Lee and sent sketches and portraits to the News, but since they were sent by sea, many were intercepted by Northerners' ships as booty of war and appeared instead in the Northern's Harper Illustrated Weekly. The News did its best to balance the pro-Southern stance of the Times by devoting long leading articles to the North, written by Harriet Martineau, probably the first woman in Britain to become a regular journalist, who had visited America from 1834 to 1836. Edwin Godkin saw the issues clearly and would have made an excellent correspondent, but, unfortunately, he was ill during the early part of the war and spent most of his time in Europe recuperating. When he returned to America, a country he had adopted, he wrote for the Daily News, setting out the military and political situation with remarkable prescience. But his health prevented his undergoing the rigors of a long campaign in the field, and so he devoted most of his writing to dispelling the English prejudice about America. There was no one, therefore, who could overcome the influence of the Times, with its seeming impartiality, due in no small way to this newspaper and its correspondence. The British public received a biased, inaccurate impression of the war, and anger between the two nations. And this created in the American government a long-lasting mistrust between the two nations. Since the American newspaper reader was only a little better informed than his British counterpart, the Civil War, despite the sweeping changes it brought in journalistic techniques, was one of the poorer periods of the progress of the war correspondence. The war did, however, have the effect of making war correspondence a separate section of the practice of journalism. It established a new breed of reporter, and also of reader, to justify his expensive existence. All that was needed now were bigger and better wars. So, until the changed circumstances of the First World War killed the correspondence off, there was hardly a corner of the globe that did not see one of them searching for a skirmish, a clash, a battle, a campaign. It was an inglorious 50-year free-for-all that one cynic termed the profession's, quote, golden age, end quote. Thank you. That's the end of Chapter 2. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Motherfucker.